Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back from lunch. I'm Denise DiPersio from the Linguistic Data Consortium, which is a center at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. We're also known as LDC. We're a permanent data repository and distribution point for language resources. And we have a research team that also develops data external relations groups. So that has to do with distribution, licensing, intellectual property, and regulatory stuff, as all of that relates to data collection and distribution. So that's where I'm coming from today in this talk, which we're calling Data Fairness and Human Language Technology Research. The idea here is that we're going to take a step back from some of the lectures you've had this week, which have been very specific, and look at the broader scope of your work and where things like fairness, bias, transparency, and even ethics can intersect with various phases of tool development, data collection, et cetera. So we're not going to have a lot of answers. We're going to raise more questions than answers. The idea is that you'll get some general concepts, and from that, maybe some guidelines for when you're faced with issues like this in terms of how to navigate them. Okay. Oh, I could use this. Okay, so this is how we're going to work this afternoon's session. I'm going to talk for about an hour and covering basically ethics. We start there very briefly. Then we'll look at how all of these issues intersect at various points in the machine learning life cycle. We'll talk a little bit about fairness and algorithms, and also take a look at what the current state of regulating big technology looks like. Then we'll take a break for about 15 or 20 minutes. When we come back, we'll reconvene in a room around the corner. It's got the big green doors. Maybe you've been there already. And then we're going to split into groups. I've developed 5 use cases that we'll distribute among 5 groups. And you're going to spend about a half an hour issue spotting in those use cases where you see some of the issues based on what you hear in the first hour or so, or even whatever other things you bring to the table. We'll then reconvene and have a group discussion where we'll review. From each group will present. They'll nominate a presenter who will sort of summarize the discussion that they had in the group, and then we'll discuss that if we have time. We'll talk a little bit about where ChatGPT fits in all of this. We've certainly been talking about a lot about that this week, and then we'll have a wrap up. Okay, so when we start with ethics, we do look for inspiration to the Greeks. Here's what I think is a great picture of the Acropolis, and in particular the Parthenon. It's really, actually, I got to see it this past weekend because I was at ICASP in Rhodes last week. Was anyone here at ICASP last week? Okay, so I stopped by Athens on the way here. It's quite inspiring. So when we think of the ancient Greeks, we think of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle sort of laying the foundations for ethics. How many of you have taken a philosophy course at any time during your journey, academic journey so far? Good. And how about ethics? Sometimes you get a straight ethics something somewhere. That's great. Okay. All right, so what is ethics? And here, just trying to find some general ways to express the idea of ethics without getting too complicated. So we take one definition that says ethics is a set of moral principles or values. So let's try to deconstruct that a little bit. What's moral? Of or relating to principles of right or wrong in behavior. What's a principle? A rule or code of conduct. And then when we look at values, we see that it's the moral principles and beliefs or accepted standards of a person or a social group. So what do we have here? We have the idea that we have some principles that relate to right or wrong that somehow have been folded in to a rule or a code of conduct, which has become a standard, accepted standards among different groups. Note that one of those groups is personal, individual, and then it can extend to the social group as well, to a larger community, to a nation, and so on. So I think a point to keep in mind here is, to the extent that you approach a problem in your research, later in your employment, you are bringing to the table the values or codes that are sort of embedded in you through your life experience so far. May not be obvious, and it may not matter one way or another, but be aware of that, because that may be something that you'll have to check, maybe make a mental check as you examine some problems that you're looking at. How are ethics expressed? Through different ways, of course: laws and policies, professional standards. I think the most well-known among those are, for instance, doctors and lawyers who have ethical codes of conduct that they follow. So as a sort of a guiding principle for today, just to keep in mind as overarching what we're thinking about, I suggest that we focus on an idea that language technologies should serve all interests of society. But what happens in the machine learning example? I would submit that even the Greeks would have to stop and think a bit when in trying to transfer what they were talking about to something like what we're dealing with today. So as we say, that ethics comes into play in all phases, whether we're talking NLP, machine learning, AI, whatever you want to call it, in all phases of the cycle, beginning with the research proposal, which can include a specification or a development plan. Data collection and data management. How you manage the data is just as important as how you collect it. Where things stand at different milestones, where the model development is, what kind of analysis are you doing on the model, testing, and then deployment. So we see where the intersections are. There are, of course, legal. There can be intellectual property rights that have to be considered, and privacy. Can be regulatory. If you're collecting from human subjects, that triggers in pretty much every country some sort of ethics review, or in the United States, an institutional review board. And then just general principles of privacy, fairness, bias, transparency, and you see that that includes the data, the model, the algorithm, and the output. And I'll just make one point too, that we're going to be using a lot of these different terms: fairness, bias, people can use them interchangeably, and even ethics. So we're trying to keep this as broad as possible, just so I don't want to get hung up in nomenclature, so we're like worrying about what words we're using. Okay, so as we say, it begins at the beginning. We shape our tools and our tools shape us. This is a quotation that's attributed to Marshall McLuhan, who is a Canadian media commentator, very famous back in the 60s and 70s, well known for like little pithy sayings, who was very interested in the growing mass advertising, television kind of environment that was happening at that time. One of the things that quotes that's attributed to him is "the medium is the message," and many others. But I like this one. I like because it's kind of showing where the tension is. That you guys are in the position of developing a model, a system, and that's here. And then there's going to be the output of the system. But is there a point along the continuum where the output starts to creep back into the original plan or design? So I think this is where, and maybe creep is the word, sometimes I've heard the term development creep. That's the way it's been explained to me in systems that I've had the privilege of working with tech guys on. But basically, keep in mind that you don't want to be overcome, or if you are, you understand why what's happening in the milestone and test stage may be trying to modify, take you away from the original objective. Maybe there's a good reason for that, but and then you modify your objective. But understand where that tension is between you who have the control and then what's happening as this model is being developed. So starting with the research question and the methodology, this happens in a lot of different contexts. So for instance, in the course of reaching academic goals, which could be the case for many of you, maybe you're planning your master's or PhD dissertation. Maybe the work you're going to do is funded by some agency, government, something like that. And so the sponsor has expectations about what the project should accomplish, and even maybe how it should be performed. And then there's just the issue of better performance. I'm going to get a better score. I have a better idea of how to solve a particular problem. But all of these examples of context will affect the way you plan the project in terms of what you select, maybe how long it's going to take, what the outcome is going to look like. So there are some strategies to think about as well. And there's the notion that that development should really be human-centered. And it's not a case where, and it can start with an idea where you say, hey, this is really cool. I think it would be great if we could do X. And that's a fine idea. But is it really great for the user to do X? Or can X be done another way? Or should you kind of step back and think how your idea or your team's idea, becomes something that's going to be useful to the end user? So that's why you want to think about potential users, you want to think about use cases, and maybe the idea that you're designing with people, not for people. So you're also, as I mentioned, you're going to be deciding what's going to be collected and measured. And then you'll think about the data that you're going to use, and in that case, you want to say, well, is there bias in this data? And what are my strategies if I think there's bias in the data? So we talk about data diversity. That can be tempered by availability. And maybe if you're in a domain that you're not too comfortable with, you try to consult domain experts to figure out what's going on. Then I think there's the question of, well, should I use a corpus that's already developed and is available to me, or should I start a collection from scratch that's going to be better for my purpose? Or should I find some raw data somewhere and use that? So, as someone who comes from an organization that has like over 900 public corpora, many of them benchmark data sets, I certainly believe that there's a benefit in using data sets that have already been developed, that maybe have already been subject to some evaluation and validation. But there's no question that there can be biases built into data sets like that, because again, they were collected with some idea in mind, with some constraints that were on them. So I think at that point, it's important for you to understand, gee, maybe they have, depending on the metadata, this is a problem. How can I account for it if I want to use this corpus, and so on. And then there's also the idea that there is really no such thing as raw data. That even raw data, to the extent it's been organized or managed, already contains some assumptions in the way that it's presented. And I think any of you who've studied postmodernism would understand a little bit like where this comes from. So that caused, quoting Bowser here in 2005, raw data is an oxymoron, basically. There's no such thing. So once you get the development process going, how do you mitigate bias in operation? And that, again, means that you're going to be looking at the model development, you're going to be looking at the metric, and the algorithm design. And then the other thing is how to be transparent. And I think the thing that I can say with some confidence that at this point, I think we're beyond the stage where people can say, well, magic happens, it's behind the scenes, it's behind the curtain. That's just not going to be acceptable, I think, anymore, given where we are today. So I think as developers, you have a responsibility to be able to help users understand how the model works, and that's a goal that you have to keep in mind as you're working through, and that means its advantages and its disadvantages. And we know that transparency in doing this, sometimes there's a trade-off with accuracy. Again, if the data collection point is the data available for your intended use, if it's going to be aggregated or linked, what about any individual privacy rights? And this relates to re-identification possibilities, given what we all know that it's possible to re-identify data on some very small data points or very few data points. And again, all the laws and the regulations and the need to be accountable are going to recur across the cycle. So now focusing specifically on data collection, I'm sharing one philosophy here that ties together two global concepts that have come to bear on data. The first is FAIR. You may have heard of the FAIR principles. This has to do with a data set that you collect and make available, and that the idea is that it be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get down to data management plans. The second one, be fair and care. Care relates to the data collection process itself, particularly with respect to under-resourced languages and indigenous languages. So the idea here is that understanding the speech community or the language community, that the collection, that there will be collective benefit to the community from the collection that's taking place, that the community has the authority to control things that happen in the collection, that collection is being carried on responsibly and according to ethical principles. So I thought we would focus, we're going to focus on two kinds of data collection. The first is human subjects, and then the second is the web. So first we're going to talk about human subjects, and for the purpose of today's discussion, when we talk about collecting from humans, I want to focus on what we call underrepresented languages or low resource languages and indigenous languages, because I think this is where a lot of the focus is now. We've heard a lot about transfer learning and other ways that people are trying to extend technologies beyond the so-called big languages. So this is where the R in care comes into in respect for language communities and speech communities. We heard about code switching this morning, and it's a fact that for low resource languages, those speakers are typically bilingual or even trilingual. They speak one language in their community, in their social group, but then when they go to school, when they have a job, when they're out beyond their community, they need other language abilities. And so our collection strategies need to recognize that as part of the dynamic. It may also come up in some languages as to who owns a language. And that's one of those questions you could debate a lot. But I think, again, it's the idea that a language can mean more to a community than just a way of communication. It's a part of a social thing, it's cultural, it relates to the family, it relates to a way of life. So it may be that in addition to any ethics review that you're going to have over a collection of an under-resourced language, you will also have to have some negotiation with the community about how the collection will proceed and how the data will be shared with them. There's a nice article by Bird 2020 that talks about the power dynamics that come into play in collecting data from communities of these languages. So think about, we heard about zero shot and we heard about transfer learning, but think about the effect of that to say, well, doesn't that disenfranchise those who have the language knowledge in their community? The quest for gold data, that's not always lining up with maybe what the goal of the community is when it wants to maybe have technology help revitalize their language, make them able to, because they want it, maybe they don't want it, but maybe they also want the value of having their language collected so that it can come back to them and be used by them. Watch the language, so you know that we use, or watch the words, unwritten language, under-resourced language, acutely under-resourced language. they can all have pejorative meanings when they're used in a context. So be aware of that. And while it's true that apps are great, apps are not, one shouldn't approach the community with the idea that I'm going to make this app and I'm going to save your language. I'm going to do this for you because this is going to help you. First of all, it may not be what people want, but at the same time, there can be a benefit the way technology can, as I mentioned, revitalize a language. And then finally, there may be some political issues that you'll have to take account of. In the case of minority languages, it could be that there are certain languages that are spoken in communities that may be not in favor with certain powers that be. If it's a small community, even with anonymization, you might be able to re-identify a speaker, and there could be retribution. But you may need to be aware of political issues as well in some of these language collections. So once you've decided what your human subjects collection is going to look like, you'll have to create some kind of protocol that will be subject to an ethics board review, and some of you may have already done this already. What this really is just a reiteration of the research proposal that you've already sketched out. You'll describe the study, how is the data going to be used and shared, how will you get informed consent, how will privacy be protected. Subjects must have the right to leave the study and withdraw their data if they wish. And you'll also need to explain data storage, security, and archiving. And all of those are important as well, to the extent that they bear on privacy and that they also bear on accessibility and making the data available broadly. So now we move to the web. So how many people have ever scraped the web to get a corpus? And it's okay, because I'm sure almost all of you have. Or even just targeted a website or two. Okay. So as you see, it's very easy. It's very easy, according to this image, to do this. And I think web scraping is having a moment, and we'll get to that in a few seconds. And I think we're there. I think in this moment today, and we can't really avoid talking about ChatGPT, unfortunately, in some sense, but people are more aware now than ever of how their data that's on the web, whether it's text, multimodal, video, whatever, whether they uploaded it voluntarily or not, is being used for machine learning applications. And certainly, that's been the case. This isn't new, that people are using the web to collect data. It's the web, since the web sort of became a place to collect data, it has been the place to collect data. But I think we're seeing sort of a tipping point or just a moment now where some of this is really going to get a little more prominent than it's been. So what are the main issues with web data? One is intellectual property. So you may notice some of those sites you scrape might have a copyright notice at the bottom. So while, yes, you can go and you can scrape it and you can follow robot.txt, or you can evade the thing that says you're a robot or whatever it is, that still might not, that still doesn't matter if the site owner or the content provider is asserting copyright in the data. The other thing to be aware of are site terms of use and restrictions. So if you've looked at those, and sometimes you have to click on a link at the bottom of the page to see those, you'll see that you can download one copy of the data for your personal non-commercial use, that it can't be revised, that you can't create derivative works from it. There's a series of different restrictions of that kind. Then there are the others. They're the ones that first of all say, well, if there's third-party data here, then you have to worry about the third party. You have to get their consent. Maybe they have a copyright issue. Then there's also the broader privacy issue, which I would say with multimodal data now is gaining further prominence, which is what about, well, we know biometric information, which includes speech, which includes facial features and other data, as well as just basically in general the privacy stuff. So there are a couple legal cases going on here, and I don't want to really dwell on them, but just to give you an idea of where some of this has been, you may have heard, about Clearview AI, that was sort of the notorious case of a company that pretty much went to every place on the web where there was a photo and sucked it down and put it into a database that they then sold to law enforcement agencies around the world. So, of course, people were really upset, not just Google and Twitter and Facebook, but people everywhere were really upset, and they got sued all over the place in the US and also in Europe. And the outcome was, at least in the United States, is that they had to, there was a settlement, they had to remove all the faces from, well, to put it more simply, they can only now sell their algorithm. They cannot sell the faces database with it. And they were also, and I know at least in Europe, they were also fined. There's another case with LinkedIn and HiQ, which has some interest. It involves the situation of, as you know, LinkedIn, you put your data up on LinkedIn, you still own your data. LinkedIn has certain rights over your data. But what right does LinkedIn have then to restrict other people's access to your data? And that's what HiQ's arguing about. So how that will come out may give some indication of where things are going to stand with websites that where someone, like in a case like LinkedIn, where you voluntarily upload information that you want other people to see, but then do you want it, mass download it for other purposes? Getty Images suing Stability AI over its image database, and a recent class action suit against OpenAI and Microsoft by GitHub users. As you know, GitHub was one of the major sites that was scraped in connection with the ChatGPT development. And those users were quite upset, claiming, first of all, violation of the terms of use of GitHub, as well as misuse of their personal information. The other thing to be aware of are the growing number of global privacy laws. So GDPR is the leading one, I think, that everybody knows. It was the first. But right now, there are over 15 countries that have data protection laws or data privacy laws of some kind. Some are modeled on GDPR and some are not. Notably, one of those is not the United States, and I doubt that there'll be any United States law anytime soon. The thing to remember about this will be, for instance, if you're collecting data from a Chinese website, you'll see in their terms of use that their terms of use are going to include the terms of China's Personal Information and Protection Act. So you can't really get away from this. These are things that you kind of have to think about, talk to the people around you that have some knowledge or ability to guide you in this area. So you're ready to collect your data, and one of the things that you'll have to provide, actually maybe even if this is more or less at the funding stage, if you're getting funded for a research project, is a data management plan. And this represents the idea that's gained a lot of traction over the last few years, that any data that's been publicly funded the resulting data, not just the resulting journal articles, which is how some of the laws, at least in the way it started to evolve in the US. But now it's the data, the underlying data itself should be made publicly available. And so around the world, there are official repositories that handle data sets like this, the UK Digital Archive, European Open Science Cloud, which is a relatively new iteration of, or new data space, I guess, in addition to others in the EU. The Australian Data Archive. It may be that your particular funding will require that the data set be deposited in a particular repository, but others just say you need to find a repository that meets certain criteria, and you can do that. So this is where you'll want to be hitting on the FAIR principles in your data management plan. You'll want to be able to explain that your data set is findable. So what does that mean? Is it going to have a DOI identifier? What kind of persistent identifier will it have? And how easy is it going to be for somebody to find it if they're trying to look for it? Is it accessible? So once they find it, how hard is it going to be to get access to the data? What are sort of the gateways that they might have to go through? Interoperable, I would say, is the weakest link here. It's a great goal, but data sets are developed under so many different conditions for so many different purposes that I think there's still quite a way to go in terms of interoperability unless you have a project or some group of people that are working in a common way and maybe are trying to make their specific corporate interoperable and reproducible. Most funders also understand constraints. So for instance, it's okay that your data may be available for research use only. It may be that there will be other licensing restrictions based on the kind of data that's been collected. Some of you may be doing some work with clinical data in the healthcare field, and when you start working with some of that data, there can be some extra steps that might have to be taken before someone can get access to your data set. Okay, so now finally the project has begun and you're coming to your milestones. So this is a good time to check on where your progress is, looking back to the assumptions that you had when you created the research plan. So you ask the question, have any assumptions changed? And if they have, how have they changed? And in line with that, maybe you need to change the model parameters to see how that may affect different groups or individuals in the potential user category. Are the workflows transparent and reproducible? And how are expectations about results affecting your model analysis? So this is where, we start then coming back to this idea like we're developing our tools or are our tools shaping us? Because you're starting to see how the model's behaving. And so are you tempted to make a change to your plan because this is the way the model behaves, and maybe you should? Or is it the case that you need to take a harder look and say, no, the model shouldn't behave that way. So maybe we need to tweak the model to see that it's more consistent with our original idea. And so again, what steps might be necessary, and this is where you would also maybe begin to take a look at false positives and false negatives. When we come to testing, I liked this image because it just said so much about all different kinds of testing, some of which I had never really heard about. But when you come to testing, here's where you need to really take a hard look and see where things are deviating from the plan. So you're asking yourself, does the model behave as expected? So again, go back to the original idea, go back to the narrative that you developed in your research plan, and then look at the model behavior and see where they are. How are they matching up or not? What's the relationship to the research question? And also, hopefully you've had some user testing, so you're able to evaluate that. And in that case, let's see. For instance, if you see on the bottom here, and they talk about 3 different kinds of testing: black box testing, white box testing, gray box testing. These are ways of expressing, whether you're having someone from the team test, somebody who sort of knows what's going on, and then a naive user who doesn't know what's going on. So what they call black box testing is something that I think can be very valuable for you to assess what happens when someone who really hasn't been with us along the way tries to do what I'm trying to accomplish. Then, again, in the test, you want to think about, is it possible that the model's output can be misinterpreted? So again, this is another time to be looking at false positives and false negatives. How well does the output reflect the data in the model? And if it doesn't, should the model be evaluated on another data set that might be around for a similar task as a check? Looking for, again, trying to troubleshoot deviations from the way from existing model behavior. Okay, so now we're here to deploy. So deploy is really when transparency comes. This is where you have to be ready to communicate what you've done and what you're saying, what you want to be thinking about. Have you met the success metric, and what are you saying about that? Are you broadly sharing your data, your research, and your methods? And what about the feedback from stakeholders at this point? It may be that depending on what you're developing, more transparency is going to be needed. So for instance, if your model, if you already know that there's some subgroup that can be disadvantaged by the way the model works, you need to be upfront about that. You need to explain that. And that may be especially relevant depending on the domain. So I would say anything, at least in some of the examples we're going to look at today, anything that relates to money, like a credit decision, a mortgage, any kind of banking application, you have to be extremely careful and make sure that, that where pitfalls are for certain users, that they're clarified. And it may be that you'll need different interfaces for different groups who may be accessing such an app. And if one of the results of the model is that someone is refused credit, someone's refused insurance, something like that, there'll have to be clear options for that person to be able to redress or talk to somebody or take steps to understand what happened and maybe repair what they've done or be able to then succeed later. You also want to understand what real-time feedback mechanisms are telling you. So I guess it's true that you're not necessarily, it may not be that somebody's trying to hack your system or the model. It may be that they are with not a good intention, but it just could be that somebody's not using your system well, not using the tool well. So this can be a way, again, to try to understand what's happening and how transparency plays into that. And then when you've deployed, did you make a decision about why we're deploying now? So this gets into the idea of active learning. And we have examples of this, and in fact, we heard this morning that maybe an earlier version of ChatGPT wasn't released because of concerns that it wasn't going to behave well. Certainly the same thing's being said of ChatGPT now, but think also of other applications. And there are different ways that, active learning, there's, like everything else, there's a continuum, I think, of active learning. There's something, well, okay, so the algorithm doesn't give us the results that we wanted. It doesn't drive as many people to this other site or ads or whatever. But then what about the autonomous driving example, where maybe that system still doesn't recognize a stop sign or a red light as well as it should. And there's a lot of accidents and maybe even fatalities. So I think that's, again, something to keep in mind. That's a question about deployment. And there are many issues that go into deployment, and then certainly some of those have been shared in the ChatGPT context, which is the race to be first. The idea that, at this point, we just want to learn from the community, so we're just going to let the crowd tell us, what's wrong with our system. We've done this, and now we're ready for that. So I think it's a balancing. It's going to depend on the case, but it's something you should be aware of. Okay, so what about algorithms, and what is a fair algorithm? This is kind of what is a little bit of the nub of some of the issues that people talk about when they talk about fairness and transparency. And I think what a lot of people will say is people who work with algorithms will say, well, they don't really know what's an unfair algorithm. It's really the idea that you have to look at the specific case and what the algorithm is doing and ask yourself these questions. What is fairness here? Who is harmed? And what's the harm? So one way that people have said, understanding that this is really a case-specific kind of analysis, they talk about differential privacy. So they say, well, if we think the algorithm has privacy implications, let's do it this way. So I put here the Harvard University Privacy Tools Project's definition, which is that anything the algorithm might output on a database containing some individual's information is almost as likely to have come from a database without that individual's information. Some of you may know Facebook has some public data sets that can be used for research that were developed using differential privacy. There's some examples in the United States that NIST ran a data challenge a few years ago, and that the 2020 US Census was actually also being presented using differential privacy. So there are ways to do it, but there can be a trade-off with accuracy. So again, it's going to be a balancing depending on what's going on. And what about algorithm audits? This is another area where people want to zero in and say, okay, well, we should audit the algorithm, or everyone should disclose how the algorithm works, and then somebody's going to decide, you know, is this right? There's going to be some group of people that are going to audit the algorithm. And again, that's another one that's tough. The GDPR doesn't require that algorithm audits, but across the board, but in cases where it talks about them, it says that one should provide meaningful information about the logic. Well, I think you can imagine that there can be differences of opinion about what's meaningful. So again, I think that this is another area where we're just going to have to see how things are going to shake out. It's going to depend an awful lot on what the particular logic is and what the situation is. Others say, well, you can do it by removing certain variables and rerunning the code. Okay. And we also know that there are lots of organizations that have proprietary concerns about algorithms, and in fact, that's what lies at the basis of a lot of patents that organizations are getting on their systems. Okay, so let's take a look at a couple of examples that can give us maybe just some context for some of the general stuff I've been talking about. These examples, again, are mostly from the US, from two sources. Cathy O'Neill's book, Weapons of Math Destruction. I don't know how many of you have read it. I would suggest it. For you guys, it would be like beach reading, you know, you could like just knock it off in a couple hours. It's really entertaining, but talks about, but I think really brings to light where some of the problems lie. And then the second is an article by Suresh and Gutag, 2021, talking about where bias crops up in the machine learning life cycle. So we see a couple of things. And first, one example that models that evaluated teacher performance based on students' standardized test scores ended up with the result that good teachers were fired and bad teachers were retained. Crime predictive software that's based on geography targets minorities and criminalizes poverty. Recidivism risk assessments that are based on arrests result in the US in false positives for African Americans. US News is a journal that rates universities, and it had a bunch of different criteria that it used when people found out what they were, and not everyone agreed it was a balanced assessment. Some schools really gamed the system and cheated, and suddenly they were like ranked like way up. There's a lot of controversy about that, and in fact now more schools are leaving this ranking system. Automatic personality tests that were administered as part of a job application process were found to discriminate against applicants with disabilities. And finally, models that use credit scores as a proxy for many different behaviors ended up equating bad credit with untrustworthiness and other kinds of behavior. So we know that it's impossible all the time to model every kind of behavior that you want to model, that you do pick proxies or that you do make decisions about what things are going to be modeled or not. But these are some examples. I think it fits each example here of the pitfalls for when you try to simplify that maybe a little too much, where some problems can crop up. So where do we stand with regulation? Since we talked about Greece a little bit, I've been talking this year about this word called akrasia, which is a Greek word that's defined in the Routledge Encyclopedia of Philosophy as the inability to act as one thinks right. So why are we where we are? Well, where are we? Well, we're here, and I think we see that every large technology company is now saying, yes, please regulate us. Yes. So the guy wearing the person wearing the Mr. Zuckerberg's mask isn't, you know, not just to single out Meta, but that's a stand-in for everybody. It could be Jeff Bezos, it could be anybody else, Microsoft, Apple. All of them are saying the same thing. And then, of course, the latest instance, this is a photo of Sam Altman when he was testifying before the US Senate a few months ago. So it feels like there's something wrong about the idea that users bear the consequences in cases like this, and why is that? It's the idea, again, sometimes it's the idea to be first, but let's not forget how much money is involved in technology today. So it's, well, on the one hand, the companies are saying, yes, please regulate us, and we want to be involved in the regulation process. On the other hand, and that's because they want to control it. That's one view, and I think it's pretty valid. And then at the same time, I know this is true in the US, I'm sure it's happening elsewhere, these companies have hired tons of lawyers who, or lobbyists who are just making sure that no laws ever get passed, which is the case in the United States, where there have been at least a dozen laws that have been pending now for 4 to 6 years, and none of them have gotten past the introduction stage in any meaningful way. So, so I think this, and yet at the same time, now we know, we've heard the doom and gloom, you know, it's generative technologies are an existential threat. It could annihilate us. So there's a lot of mixed messages going on here. But I just want you to think about the fact that here we have the smartest people in the world working for these companies. So why are we here? And yet these guys all took philosophy courses too. They certainly understand how the world works. Okay, so I just have a couple of examples of regulation. Just a few examples from US, Europe, and China. And we see in the US, the first example, Twitter, which is just, to me, kind of funny because there was an FTC order that had been in place for about 10 years that said that they couldn't do certain things, and they just pretty much ignored it. And the order said, if you don't do this, you're going to have to pay $120 million. So they're like, okay, so they paid the $120 million last year, and they said, oh, we're sorry, you know, we just didn't obey the order. Zoom, data breach, TikTok, unauthorized data sharing and ad targeting, Meta, biometric data violations, and unauthorized user tracking. In Europe, GDPR, again, leading the way through various national agencies that are sort of have jurisdiction, I guess, over these cases. WhatsApp, data use violations, Facebook privacy, Clearview AI, that's the biometric case I talked about. Also fined in France, Instagram, unlawful processing of children's data, how about that? And Uber, data breach. In China, it's been a bunch of different things, but all of the, pretty much across the board, Alibaba, Ant Group, Didi, and Tencent have been subject to some actions for data and privacy breaches and also for antitrust violations. So what's the takeaway from this? I mean, the numbers are pretty big. I mean, they look kind of big, and if you add up for you know, just Meta with its associated companies, it's quite a number. But you know, the question is that really a deterrent given the value of these companies and the money at stake? I don't know. Okay, so that gets us to the end of the first part of the talk, which I think was a little less than an hour. So I guess if anyone has any questions, we can do that before we take a break. Yes.
Sorry. I'm not sure it's a question because I don't know if there is any answer, but when you talk about the big companies, it's difficult not to think about the states that are behind when we know the legislation in US and China. Well, there's a big issue about, for instance, in Europe, if I take a database that I think most people will know, it's VoxCeleb, which has been collected in US using the web. In US, you have the fair use. In Europe, it should be forbidden to use this kind of database, although except for one Swiss lab that I know, all the labs I know of are using it. So is there any really decence in talking about data privacy, data legislation, when we know that the first which are violating the laws are the states which are involved, and I include the European ones which are maybe less obvious, but...
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, and it's true that fair use has worked in favor of machine learning basically in the United States. The United States courts have been receptive to the idea that using copyrighted data for machine learning is a new transformative use that wasn't part of the original use. But technically, it doesn't cover like the terms of use. So when Google changed its terms of use for YouTube in late 2020 to make it clear that to collect identifying information, which included faces, you needed the consent of the uploader. That would not be covered under fair use. VoxCeleb is an interesting data set. I don't know what to say about that, except that I think one way that they got around part of the problem, at least from the provider's viewpoint, was only giving the URLs to download the videos and not providing the full videos in the corpus. I don't know if that really answers your question. I don't think there is an answer. You're right. You're right. There really isn't. Yes.
So thank you for the presentation. This is the question is on this slide. As we see, money is not enough of an incentive to make this company comply. Are there other solutions?
I'm sorry. Could you repeat your question?
Yeah. The prices of the fines are clearly huge, but not enough for these companies. So, are there other solutions than money to make them comply?
I think that's behind some of the thinking. I think even in Europe there have been some antitrust kinds of based actions, and I know that's one of the theories in the US that's like, well, maybe we don't need a data protection law, but we'll bring in antitrust law, and an antitrust violation, and the effect of those could be breaking apart the companies. You know, if you think back to other big monopolies in history, so we break them apart so they have less power, and we take away power, and we invest, you know, we have separate entities that have different responsibilities, something like that. Yeah, I don't think the money is a deterrent at all. And I think that I don't even think I mean, some of this stuff it's not, we know about it, we hear about some of these things, but we don't hear about all of them, and there's many more than, this is only what's really happened in the last year or two that I've put here. This isn't meant to be a comprehensive history, but there doesn't seem to be an embarrassment factor either at play. Yes?
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I have a question regarding the quantity of data per language. Is it unfair to do this kind of restriction for low resources languages? Now when, we do have a lot of resources for some languages, and if we want to collect data for low resource languages, we don't have a lot of resources. So if you add this kind of restriction, it will be maybe hard to put them, in the side of well-resourced languages.
Well, I think what I'm trying to suggest is the way to approach languages like that. I'm not suggesting that you can't collect them and make a corpus of them and make the corpus available, because that's been done. And there are resources and more resources all the time for these languages, not as many as you have for bigger languages, obviously. But what I'm suggesting is just rethinking the approach to doing so, and I think that I think that success can be achieved. And this happens all the time to me at LDC when people come and talk to me, and we start talking. They think I'm telling them no, And I just remind them in all my years there, I've never told them no. I've just suggested yes, but, you know, or this way, or think about this. So, so I think that's what I'm suggesting, that there are ways. And I'm not saying that transfer learning is bad, that it's evil or something. I understand why it's useful and why it can be helpful. But and other ways that people try to bootstrap systems into other languages, that's been happening for a long time. But I also think that we should be thinking, if we want to say that language technology should benefit all interests in society, then let's think about how, when I develop that system, when I add that language to my MT system, how is that really, how's that helping that language community, et cetera? Same thing with speech, with apps. Okay. All right, so I think we're good for a break. Why don't we reconvene at 3? We'll move to the other room.